Hey students, how are you? Is everybody doing okay? Let's do a little video lecture here on the hippie movement. Now, believe it or not, a lot of people think that the hippie movement didn't have a big impact on U.S. American society. Uh, it didn't have a big impact like other civil rights movements, but it promoted a lot of awareness. And some people call it the hippie movement. I think the word hippie was first used in 1965, I think. Let me check my notes here. Yeah, I want to make sure. It was the same year that LSD was crystallized and synthesized, which was 1965. That's the year I was born. So now I can claim something exciting happened. LSD was synthesized and hippies, the word hippie was first used in 1965. If prior to then, they would call themselves beatniks because they followed the beat of music, or they called them nature movements. There were instances way before the 1960s and the opening of the first counterculture hippie clothing store that was opened in 1961 by Vito Politikas and his wife Sue, and that spelled SZOU. Yeah, there you go. So they're the first ones that started selling, that kind of clothing. So we can honestly say that if we have to come up with a date for the beginning of the hippie movement, I would say 1961. Uh, Now, classical culture in the world, being vegan, living with nature, those are not new things. There was a Persian by the name of Mazdak that did it. The Greeks, and I always butcher the Greek names because I'm sorry. Uh, the Diogenes of Sinope, the Cynics, there's also a lot of the information that points to that hippies looked at Jesus Christ and they looked at Buddha and St. Francis de Assisi, and Henry Thoreau, and you have hippie commune, Marymount, in 1625 that was very, very short lived. Nathaniel Hawthorne talks about them. So there is this hippie movement, and I think that one of the things that the hippie movement likes to do is to get away from industrialization. In the late 1800s and 1900s, a bunch of Germans were moving away, and they were, and again, I don't want to butcher any words, but Levin's reform movement, where they emphasized the goodness of nature and the harms that industrial society was creating in the world. So they would create these nature clubs. You had, Nietzsche and Goethe and Hermann Hesse and individuals like that who went around and attracted a lot of Germans that rejected urbanization, and they wanted to go back to nature and the spirit of nature. I think it's just something that maybe we should be doing right now in the wake of the pandemic. That how sustainable can we be now? How do we get to California? Well, it was Germans, really. And what they did is that they came to the United States in the 1920s, 1930s, or right around 1934, when you have your first health food store that started by Herman. Uh, Let me see the name here. Sex Hour. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, all right, but he was born in Germany, and let me check my notes here. He left Germany in 1906. He went to New York, but he went to California. Now, why do all these hippies go to California? Why is California so incredibly attractive? Well, California is like Texas on steroids without cold weather. So you have, a really good climate. So, I mean, you can grow stuff year round. At one time, land was plentiful because it was really hard to go from the East Coast to the West Coast. Um, and that's really it. And it's very easy to create these societies in California where you don't have to depend on electricity and any of those things, right? They start things like nature, the quote nature boys, and he started the first. And I'm gonna read this because I don't want to get it wrong. Um, Sex Hour started, in my notes, I put that he started stores where you could live in a pacifist, raw vegan, non-conformant lifestyle. Remember, we have to be careful because Charles Manson tried to do the same thing and ended up murdering a bunch of people. The problem with the hippie movement is that it attracts a lot of quacks. You have people that really want to do that. Now, I'm going to tell you right up front before we go any further that what kills the hippie movement is the simple fact that these kids that are rebelling against conformity, because that's what they're rebelling against, these individuals that are rebelling against conformity and rebelling at what their parents have become, realized primarily after Woodstock, um, in 1969, was that we can't do this forever. We can't go around, smoke weed, and drop acid for the rest of our lives. I mean, at some point we need to stop. So you do have a culmination of it. You have a gradual culmination of the hippie movement that increases. But by 67, 68, the Summer of Love is in 67. A lot of music. I remember asking my former professor, Douglas Richmond, questions about the Summer of Love and the Monterey Music Festival because he was actually in California when these events happened. And I made a comment, I wish I could have seen Jimi Hendrix, play at the Monterey Music Festival. And he just kind of laid back like that. And he looked up and he said, I wish I could have just remembered it. That's hilarious. Doug Richmond is an old hippie, and he has been one of the most influential professors in my academic career. Now, around 63 in San Francisco, you begin to see Ken Kesley. Uh, and they start participating in CIA-sponsored LSD trials. Then you have, uh, you know, the Merry Pranksters, and you begin to see a culmination of the beginning of the beatnik movement. You begin to see this stylistic dress that comes out of let me see, Paulinka. That's his name, Paulinka and Susie's store, where you begin to see colorful psychedelic, and you start playing it cool. A lot of smoking weed, and I can only imagine, they had this really low grade, just trash weed, but they were doing it. And they start writing, they start saying that their society is oppressive. And what begins to happen is uh, you begin to see the sense of nonconformity. You begin to see, with the coming of Vietnam, a lot of these kids begin to have students that they went to school with that are being killed. And of course, a lot of acid. You know, uh, Tom Wolfe comes up with, chronicles of the electric Kool-Aid acid test, and you begin to have a social revolution. Now, it wasn't just drugs. A lot of these individuals participated in anti-drug protests, and that in itself was very important.